Sure. Um, Good morning, everyone. Next up, we have Ditebogo, Masha, and Michael Burke presenting their paper titled "The Important Sampling Forests for Location Invariant Propriocetive." My apologies. Propriocetive terrain classification.
Apologies about that. I didn't realize I had my mic off. Okay. Let me share. Sorry for that. Sorry about that. Give me please.
Take your time. You have enough time. Ditebogo, are you still there? Oh, excellent. There we go.
Sorry about that. Just. Okay, yeah. So I'll be presenting a paper about important sampling forests for location invariant proprioceptive terrain classification. The work forms part of my master's work that I completed in 2020. So the problem statement for the paper was to investigate offline classification of terrain using simple will slip estimate, random forest, and input sampling, and to enable the implementation of an inexpensive terrain classification. When we look at the figure below, it shows the terrain setup that I had in the lab. This work was done at the CSIR. At the time, I was a master's student there with the University of Johannesburg. So I was using the terrain setup of grass, carpet, and rocks, and carpet as well. Carpet is rubber carpet. It's surrounding area on the patch from the patch. And then the platform I was using is this platform as the image shows. So the solution approach for the problem that we had was we would calculate will slip estimations or measurements using rotational velocities. This is because we wanted to differentiate or classify the terrain using a simple method that doesn't require additional sensors or anything extra. So we wanted to keep the method cost effective. The secondly, we proposed an important sampling forest algorithm. So this algorithm infuses random forests or decision trees and important sampling together. And thirdly, the terrain, we classify the terrain through slip-only estimates using support vector machine and decision trees. But then for the presentation, I will only do a summary for the support vector machine in comparison to decision trees. I will not show the actual results for the support vector mission. And then lastly, we classify the terrain using the proposed importance sampling forest classification method. So the terrain classification basically can be vision-based or proprioceptive-based. But then for my research work, I focused on proprioceptive terrain classification, and that was proprioceptive, meaning touch-based sensing. So that's why I used it, because it enabled us to use sleep estimates. The figure we see below, it corresponds to the image we've seen previously, where we've seen the patches. This whole area L, I only took a patch out to represent the rubber. And then this is the actual mat, and then this was where the grass is on the green side, and then this was where the rocks is. So proprioception for ground vehicle involves the sensing of internal state of vehicle using onboard sensors such as wheel encoders, accelerometers, rate reducers, as well as gyroscopes. So that's the vibrations. Basically, you're measuring the vibrations as the vehicle transfers the different terrains. So like I said earlier on, when I started presenting, we will be focusing on wheel sleep estimate. And previously, Michael Burke and a paper that I had presented previously showed that we can use wheel sleep to analyze as a low-cost terrain analysis technique. So this work furthers that. Wheel sleep occurs as a result of wheel-terrain interaction. Like I said, as the vibration happens, the wheels, they lose traction, and that's where sleep occurs. So for the experimental setup, I've mentioned I used a PECPOP, which is a track-based mobile platform ground vehicle. And then the data that I used consists of indoor and outdoor terrain surfaces, mainly green or grass, and then rocks, carpet, and rubber carpet. The data consists of a combination of actual and desired velocity, rotational velocities, the track length, and the pitch of the cycle. That's what we use to determine the sleep estimation. And then the forward and rotational velocities are estimated by the platform using a localization algorithm that fuses odometry data, IMU, and point cloud data. So the estimation of this data came with the PECBot, so it was built into the platform when it was purchased. So I don't have more data on how the fusion occurred. I only retrieved the forward velocities and the rotational velocities as values. And then because of the different senses that were on the platform and the different rates of senses, I had to use a spline interpolation method on the collected data, so that the data corresponds to measure position measurements. So for instance, I had an RMU that published data at a speed of 5 megahertz, and then 50, and then I had the odometry reading that we're publishing the measurements at a slower rate. So to correspond the data, I had to use interpolation, a spline interpolation method. From the data that was used, was restricted to only when the platform was moving forward, because we were using rotational and speed estimate. When it's moving forward, that's the only time we have those values. If it stops or if it's rotating, the forward velocity is 0. So we cannot compute our slip from that. That's why the data that I use only considered when the vehicle was in motion. And then from the data, we collected 2 different data sets that we collected using 2 different setups. I will show that later on. So Earlier on, I showed another picture that looks like this, which showed the first data set A, which I call the data set A setup. And then this picture on the side shows the data set B terrain laid out. So from this side, the carpet is below, and then we have the rocks, and then we have the grass, and then we have the rubber mats. So this is a different setup. So data was collected on two different setups called dataset A and B for test A and B respectively. So we used rotational velocity and a method that was proposed by Burke in to calculate the adaptive sleep estimation. We used equation 1, which calculated for the left track, equation 2 calculated for the right track, the sleep, because there are two different independent tracks. And from there, we used equation 3 to determine the overall rotational velocity, and that's where we result in our sleep estimation. The method we propose uses importance sampling, where importance sampling is a Monte Carlo sampling tool that is used to approximate a distribution when the only sample available are produced by a different distribution. So from that, using this importance sampling method, we sampled a new distribution using a random sampling draws from the original data that we had. So I will explain further on what I meant about this. And these are the equations that equation 5 and equation 6 are the ones that we use to improve the accuracy of importance sampling. This is the importance sampling forest algorithm that we actually introducing to solve the problem of sleep estimation, of terrain classification using sleep only estimation. So we let the terrain class T we let C be the terrain class at T, and then we let X be the position estimate. So we introduce position estimates into our sleep estimates. We no longer use only sleep estimation only, we use position as well. And then from there, we will fit a decision tree algorithm into the data. And then from the results, that's when we will sample new data. We will sample new data so that we can train our importance sampling forest model. The goal of the proposed ISF model is a classification model, is to find the expected terrain class C at position X with respect to the sleep classifier distribution given by equation 7. And we accomplish this using importance sampling forest. Like I said, we train a classification method using decision tree. And then from the decision tree data that predictions that we receive, we use importance sampling to resample on the already predicted new data. So that way we improve the accuracy of the classifier. And then when we retrain, we take the predicted data, we introduce position as well into the data, and then that's when we retrain our ISP model. So our ISP model is trained using position, which is X, we train using X, which is our position, and then S, which is our sleep estimates. So after we've trained the models, for the results, we first test using sleep only classification using decision tree. So when we tested on dataset E for both support vector and decision tree, I'll later show the table that shows comparison. And when we train on decision tree at first glance, when you look at the image on the right, you can compare to the initial image we saw at the beginning. You are under the impression that the method is performing, the decision tree classifier is performing well. But then we move over, we train our we test our algorithm using a different setup for test B. The initial training method that we used here, sorry to go back and forth, that we used here returned an accuracy of 89%. But then when we did our tests, when we did our test, you can realize that actually the classifier was overfitting. So it was overfitting to the setup that was presented, that was trained with it. So the classifier, the decision tree classifier using sleep only estimates, it's not working. And then we move over, we trained our data, we trained our model, we tested the performance using the proposed method, and then the confusion matrix showed us that actually our model is performing much better than it is when we introduce position estimates rather than just sleep estimates alone, and we resample on that. When the ASV terrain classification method was used, the terrain and the terrain type, the classifier returned an accuracy score of 94% for test A. Test A, it's sort of using this data. And then test B is using this one. So this one was the confusion matrix for the results for test A. The accuracy was 94%. And the method seems promising, but then remember with the first decision tree testing, it also seemed promising. So we had to test again using our, sorry about this. We had to test again using our, using dataset B. So when we look at the patches, we can say that, yes, of course, there are outliers that the terrain would predict, but then as like the 94 accuracy, we got it when we look at the terrain, the sample of it, we can see that it was performing better. But then also we move over to test with test B for position estimate, and then our classifier resulted in a result of accuracy of 97%. This shows that the proposed terrain method, the proposed classification method, actually, when we introduce position estimates, it works better than when we only use sleep estimation only. It is important to note
Sorry
that...
to interrupt you, Ditebogo. You have about 3 minutes left in your presentation.
Oh, okay. It's okay.
For your slot, yes.
Yeah, okay, sorry about that. So to the table below summarizes the comparison from for the test A and test B. When we use support vector machine, we can see that for test A, it seems to be performing because it's overfitting. But then when we introduce test B, it fails. Where for decision tree as well, test A seems to be performing well, but then when we introduce a different data set, it fails because it was overfitting. But then for our proposed method, when we use test A, where we introduce position estimate, it was 94%, and then when we do the test B, it gave us an accuracy of 97%. That shows that the model is promising and it's not overfitting. In conclusion, this work highlighted the importance of terrain classification models in multiple terrain configuration to avoid overfitting. Experimental results show that sleep-based decision tree or support vector machine classifier failed to classify the terrain surfaces due to loss of generalization caused by overtuning or model parameters or overfitting. This work produced an ensemble terrain classification, which allows terrain classification that incorporates spatial information. It's important to note that even though we introduce position estimate, it doesn't mean that this approach won't work when we introduce it to the new locations. It is invariant location. It doesn't depend on the location as it and on the position. You don't have to retrain to reuse the model, the classifier, even though it's on a new even though it's on a new terrain or a new setup altogether of data. Thank you.
Thank you, Ditebogo.